in practice, third rank all India. He also has an excellent academic records and ranks throughout his career. Sunil Bhatt started his career in indirect taxes and of sales tax in the early days of career with a tax regime to VAT regime and a logical extension of diversified to service tax practice. He has an experience of almost 2 decades. Sunil Bhai is actively involved in the policy formation of GST, keenly follows up the development in regards to emerging law. Throughout his professional career, he has more than 2 decades experience. Sunil Bhai has delivered lectures and of topics professional interests, various industries, states, bodies. He is an NACIN accredited trainer and regularly conducts training sessions for department officers. He has also written articles of various professional and business journals and regularly quoted in newspapers and index tax related issues. Sunil Bhai was a president of Bombay Chartered Accountants Society for 2008 and 2018 and 2019, and currently a chairman of Indirect Taxes Committee of the society, and is also a member of the study group constituted by Maharashtra government of implementing GST. Over to you, Sunil Bhai.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashant Bhai, for inviting me to speak at this forum. And thank you, Priya, for handling the entire registrations, coordinations, and making sure that the event starts in a correct and a timely fashion. The topic, friends, which has been allotted to me is relating to e-invoicing under GST, which of course has been there as a part of the talk since quite some time. Ever since the GST has been introduced, we have been talking about slow and gradual adaptation of technology to ensure better compliances in the country. And in that regard, I would believe that it's really not slow and steady, but it's fast and furious. The way the technology has really pervaded into this entire field. And I think one of the questions which we were just chatting around a few minutes ago in terms of the participant queries is, why is e-invoicing made mandatory? I think the answers are obvious. The government wants a much better compliance, and they find that once things are automated, there are checks and balances in place, and therefore it's much easier to administer a law digitally rather than through a battalion of officers and bureaucrats who at times can result in a lot of slippages of revenues at points of time. So digital definitely is the way forward, and we are seeing that happen. Even in income tax, we are seeing that we are having a faceless assessments, which has been now implemented all the way up to the ITAT appellate level. And there are, of course, a few exceptions and teething problems in each of these, but I think digitization is the way ahead, and we can keep on debating till the cows come home, but it's going to be there. And the earlier we accept this as a reality, easier it will be for us to really implement this entire set of provisions relating to the e-invoicing. Now, friends, as we all know, e-invoicing has already been into place for entities which are above 50 crores of turnover per annum. And it's been quite some time since it has been there. And therefore, I would presume many of you would have already implemented it. Those who have not implemented it, and by any chance, if you are above 50 crores, please treat this discussion as a wake-up call. Better late than never. And I can tell you that the government, with its types of analytics of data which is available with them, it's not going to be long time before they will pounce upon you if e-invoicing is applicable to you, but you have not implemented it. So yes, we know when we look at the statistics, we find that it's not that all the people who are liable for e-invoicing have implemented e-invoicing, but I'm sure in times to come, things will become more stricter, and therefore it's better to get it implemented as early as possible. Just as a basic background, we understand that under GST, we have this new phrase called B2B versus B2C. And as far as e-invoicing is concerned, there are two fundamentally different approaches towards B2B invoicing and a B2C invoicing. Now, what do we mean by B2B and B2C? All of us are aware B2B is a scenario where our customer to whom we raise an invoice has a GST registration, and therefore it's a business to business transaction. The taxes which you charge would be available to the client as a credit in most of those scenarios, and therefore there is a need for a better compliance and a real-time reconciliation. And that are the objectives when we look at B2B e-invoicing. And therefore, the threshold for B2B e-invoicing is slowly and gradually reduced. As of today, we have a threshold of 50 crores, and we are even expecting that this threshold will even go lower than this at some point of time. The whole objective of this B2B invoicing comes from the fact that today we are giving input tax credits only on the basis of matching of credits uploaded by the vendor into your GST portal. All of us here are aware about the concept of a 2A versus a 3B matching, which means that if you have a valid tax invoice, but if the vendor has not uploaded the tax into your GSTR 2A, as we popularly call it, then there are restrictions on claiming that credit. The tolerance limit is 5% of unmatched credit as of now. And of course, earlier it was allowed, and then there have been lots of debates and notices on that point. Now, to really resolve all those issues, what we are trying to do is we are trying to prepone this entire compliance and reconciliation routine, because a common complaint which a person always has is, look, I deal with a vendor on a particular date. He is expected to file his return in the next month. And when he files the return in the next month, till that time, I already paid him the money, everything is done. So the law is expecting me to do an impossible by making sure that my vendor uploads the credit into my 2A. So to respond to that, and that's where the entire e-invoicing provision comes very handy. What we are told is that the supplier will, on a real-time basis, upload the invoice. In fact, before he generates the invoice, he will generate a unique number from the portal known as IRN. And only if that IRN is there on the tax invoice, it will be treated as a valid invoice. And once that happens, the IRN is generated, the entire data is populated on the GST portal. And therefore, the buyer is at least assured that the information has flown into the GST system. And that's where the compliance and reconciliation apparently is expected to become much easier because of the B2B e-invoicing. Now, when you friends compare this B2B e-invoicing with the concept of B2C, in B2C, there is nobody who is claiming the credit because the customer doesn't really have a GST number. He might be an end consumer. Of course, in our trade, limited scenarios like this. So in these types of scenarios, there is really no requirement for a real-time information to the government. But at the same time, we want to ensure that the evasion is as minimal as possible. And we also want to facilitate digitized payments. And therefore, what we are told is we have a very high benchmark over here. We are told B2C e-invoicing will apply only above 500 crores. And where what will be done here is there will be a dynamic QR code created. That dynamic QR code will enable the buyer to directly link that with a UPI-based payment mechanism, and an online payment can be facilitated through that entire process. Naturally, because this covers very large-scale retail transactions with very small volumes, therefore, it would not be feasible to handle this on the portal. And therefore, for B2C e-invoicing, the QR code has to be system generated by the company, by the taxpayer himself. He is not dependent on the portal. Unlike in the case of B2B e-invoicing, where the person is dependent on the portal, he has to reach out to the portal, and will understand a few mechanisms through which a person can reach out to the portal, and what are the strategies through which he should do that. But there is a dependency that one has to go to the generation portal, IRN generation portal, and obtain the B2B e-invoicing from that place. So that, friends, is the overall objective of B2B versus B2C e-invoicing. What we are told is, as far as B2B e-invoicing, from 1st April 2021, all entities having aggregate turnover in any of the preceding years above 50 crores would be liable for B2B e-invoicing. Of course, on a trial basis, it was started in October 20 with entities above 500 crores. That 500 crore limit was then reduced to 100 crores in January 21, and thereafter to 50 crores from April 21. And as of today, this April 21 limit of 50 crores is applicable for B2B e-invoicing. Of course, as I told you, there is an objective to really bring these 50 crores down, perhaps to maybe 10 crores and then 5 crores. But as of now, we don't have the dates for that entire applicability when it will get implemented. But as of now, yes, 50 crores, if your turnover Please note, it's not only 1 year, it's any of the preceding previous financial years. If your turnover, aggregate turnover has been above 50 crores, you are liable for B2B e-invoicing. As far as B2C e-invoicing is concerned, it's only for very large taxpayers above 500 crores. And thereafter, of course, there was a relaxation from penalty provisions as far as B2C e-invoicing is concerned, and that relaxation continues till date. Now, how does one know whether you are eligible or applicable for e-invoicing or not? The answer to that is you can check. The government has created around 8 to 9 websites, and each of them starts with this e-invoice 1, e-invoice 2, etc. So instead of 1, you can substitute it by 2, 3, 4. This is the website where you will go and check. There is a tab called check your applicability. Type a GST number and you will know whether e-invoicing has been implemented or enabled for you. What is mentioned there is, of course, based on the data which was available with them. If according to you, you are liable, but the portal shows that you are not liable, there is a process in which you will send an email to the designated persons and they will then enable e-invoicing for you. Similarly, if the portal says applicable, but you believe it is not applicable, again, you write to them saying that, look, these are my facts, these are my turnover limits, and therefore I am not liable for to do an e-invoicing. So please amend the status on the portal. So while the status on the portal is indicative, what ultimately will follow on a legal course is what has been mentioned as a turnover and the law which has been referred to in the notifications which we just talked about. So how does this entire thing work? And because B2C e-invoicing is not portal dependent, the primary objective is only to facilitate digital payment, and also it applies to very large entities, and that too at an optional level. Our focus from this slide onwards is going to be on B2B e-invoicing, which is much more rampant and much more important from a general perspective. And when we look at that perspective, let's understand how this entire e-invoicing process works. So typically, before the e-invoicing became applicable, what an entity would do is they would have some ERP or an invoicing software, or maybe Excel also, depending on the size of the organization. What an entity will do is it will collect all the information which is required for the purposes of for the purposes of raising an invoice. It will put it in Excel or in the software, and then they will do a print command or an email command, and it would go as an invoice to the customer. And it many times you will print it and then courier it. Sometimes you will send it by email, depending on the various organizational strategies. Now, what we are told is, before you really do all this and sign that document, you need to, on that invoice, incorporate one number known as invoice reference number, IRN. And we'll be using this word very frequently in the next few slides. Now, how do you get this IRN? You are told that all this information you have to send to the portal, which we just referred to, invoice registration portal. You have to send this information, and you have to send this information in a specific format known as a JSON format. This is a little bit technical, but for those who are inclined, it may be important to understand this. There's some mandatory and optional information which you will send it in this format. Once you send this information to the invoice registration portal, the invoice registration portal will generate this IRN QR code. It will attach this IRN QR code onto the data which you have sent, into the file which you have sent, and it will return back that file to you. Now, once you get this file back, you can convert it into an invoice, or you can derive the IRN from that document and include it in your normal invoice. And thereafter, you can print or email the invoice to the client. So essentially, there is an intermediary step which has been introduced, which is a call to a IRP, invoice registration portal, sending off the mandatory data and the schema which has been mentioned, and obtaining back an IRN QR code from the invoice registration portal. So this is the interposing step which does come in. Now, while this step might work for one or two invoices wherein you can log in onto the GST portal, create a JSON file, upload it, download a JSON file, use a converter and read it back into a normal column, and then come back into the invoicing software. What typically happens is, most of the entities would not want to do all of these technicalities and the difficulties themselves. So they would appoint some third party. And ever since GST has been introduced, we are aware that there are third party softwares known as ASPs and GSPs. who will prepare softwares, they will have some good interface and they will allow you to put data there, and they will then interact with the government portal in the technical formats and the things required. So most of the organizations would want to use an ASP/GSP. Now, if you are using an ASP/GSP, what typically is done is the information from the ERP is first sent to the ASP/GSP. Now, when you send this information to ASP/GSP, there could be various ways in doing it, and depending on the complexity of your organization, the complexity of your invoicing software or the ERP or the accounting software, you might want to choose one of these three methods. Because if you have one transaction in a day, you might say that, okay, I will pick up the data from my ERP and type it once again in the ASP/GSP software, and then ask the software to do all those things. But if you have, let's say, 50 invoices, 100 invoices in a day, it may be difficult. You'll need 3 people more to type that data. And then if they make mistakes in that data, you'll keep on doing more and more reconciliations. So in that case, you might want to pick up the data from your ERP in an Excel sheet or a CSV format. And at the end of the day, have all this information and send it to the ASP/GSP through what is known as a batch process. So at some regular intervals, you can, depending on the volumes and other things, you can define, 1 hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours, or maybe end of the day or twice a day, something like that. And through a batch process, send this data to ASP/GSP for further processing. Or the best case scenario is have a real-time connectivity, have a link between your ERP and the ASP/GSP, whereby the moment a person enters the information in his ERP or the invoicing software, it is automatically pushed to the ASP/GSP and the validations are done at their level, and the IRN is also generated at a real-time level. Now, depending on the software availability and the complexity, I am aware that various entities have chosen different modules out of these three. But according to me, the manual feeding of information is the least preferred option. It's either real-time connectivity or a batch process connectivity. Now, typically what the ASP/GSP will do is it will have an API, what is a real-time link with the invoice registration portal. And using that API, the data which has been collected from the ERP will be sent to the invoice registration portal in a JSON format. It will obtain the IRN QR code from there and then keep it back in the ASP/GSP so that it can come back into your ERP or your invoicing software in an appropriate manner. So that is the process which we broadly understood. The first process was a scenario where you directly log in into the GST portal and do it through an offline mode where you need a JSON file and a JSON converter. And the second is where you have a third-party software called an ASP/GSP, and then you subscribe to that ASP/GSP and link it through either a real-time connectivity or a batch process mode. But exactly what are the transactions which are liable for this e-invoicing, and what are the types of the various documents which will be governed by this process? And this checklist, and I'm aware that in the checklist of questions which we have quite a few questions around this front. So I'll spend a few minutes on this checklist of the transactions or the documents and the applicability of the requirements of e-invoicing. So we start with the fundamental aspect of B2B invoice. You might be raising a terminal handling charge invoice. It's a B2B invoice. The exporter or the importer might be interested in claiming the credit of that taxes. And therefore, it being a B2B invoice will be liable for e-invoicing. It will be an IRN QR code will be applicable to that. Please note, it's not only your key operational businesses where you raise B2B invoices. You might sell an old asset. If you are also having transportation as an activity, you might sell old tires and scrapped tires. Those scrap tires might be sold to a dealer who is registered. These are also examples of B2B invoicing, wherein you will not take it to your top line. It will go in your other income or your asset schedule. But because you are selling some product or providing some other service where there is a GST involved and an input tax credit involved, there will be a B2B invoice and e-invoicing will trigger into that. There will also be a requirement of a B2B invoice, which is with an e-invoicing provision for branch transfers. As you are aware, because of the GST implementation, all organizations which have branches in different states are required to take separate registrations for each of those states and have to have decentralized billings. And thereafter, there's this concept of branch transfer. If your assets or goods move from one state to another, you are required to raise a tax invoice as a branch transfer invoice. Similarly, if there are some shared services or a project which is partially executed from 2 or more states, then there is a branch transfer of service involved. And all these branch transfer invoices also an e-invoice would be applicable. Now, as you know, for an invoice, there could be a debit note or a credit note. Now, this debit note or a credit note also, if it's a B2B transaction, will require an e-invoice applicability. Please understand that there is a difference between a GST debit credit note versus a commercial debit credit note. A GST debit credit note will always be an addition or a subtraction to an originally issued invoice. Many times the business uses the word debit notes and credit notes very loosely to include accounting or commercial debit notes or credit notes. Sometimes many logistics companies also charge reimbursement of expenses. And for reimbursement of expenses, there is a debit note. Now, if there is no GST charged in those documents, let us say you pay customs duty on behalf of the exporter and you want to treat it as a pure agent, you can't levy GST on the customs duty component. But to recover the money, you have to raise a document on the client, and therefore you will raise an accounting debit note. This is not a document which will go through the IRN QR code routine. This is not something which will go through the e-invoicing route. It is only the GST debit notes, credit notes, which will come in the e-invoicing processes. Export invoices also e-invoicing will be required. So if you have an export collect shipment, which typically fits within the basket of export of services, in that scenario also you will be required to raise an e-invoice. As far as a B2G transaction is concerned, where you are dealing with the government, again, whether it's an invoice, debit note or a credit note, e-invoicing will be required. If the government has a GST number, you will use the GST number. If they do not have a GST number, but they have a GST TDS number, then you will use that GST TDS number. Now, as far as B2C is concerned, there is a dynamic QR code for transactions above 500 crores. As we said, that's not something which is very relevant from a day-to-day perspective, so we'll skip that. But the general IRN QR code does not apply to B2C transactions. For exempted supplies, you are not allowed to issue an invoice. You are required to raise a bill of supply. So for example, air freight, international air freight is exempted from payment of GST. So you cannot raise a tax invoice. You will be raising a bill of supply for that. And for such bill of supplies, e-invoicing is not applicable. Now, RCM, there have been a lot of confusion and queries. As you know, in RCM, the supplier doesn't pay the tax, but the recipient pays the tax, which means, and a common example is Goods Transport Agency, GTA, where instead of the transporter paying the tax, it is the client, the payer of the freight, who ends up paying the GST. Now here, what we are told is, and this is very important, outward RCM, which means if I am a supplier, let's say I am a Goods Transport Agency who is registered and who has a turnover above 50 crores, I will still be raising an invoice. But in that invoice, I will be lying, I will be writing, is the supply liable for reverse charge? Yes. And I will still issue a tax invoice to the customer. I will not pay the tax. I will not collect and pay the tax. I will tell to the customer that, look, you have to pay the tax, but I will prepare a proper GST invoice. This GST invoice, the transporter who is showing the income of transport, but not paying the GST, he will have to raise a valid e-invoice for this. And this will be outward RCM at his end. As far as the company who receives the transport services, he discharges GST on the expense. For him, he will prepare a self document or a self voucher or an invoice. And for this self invoice, IRN or QR code is not applicable. It's applicable only on your revenues, incomes, and not on your expenses. So that is where the distinction or the confusion as far as RCM and e-invoicing is concerned. These are some of the mandatory fields in the e-invoice. All of us are aware, and I'm aware that by now most of us would have already incorporated all this information in our systems to capture this information as far as the customer is concerned. The mandatory data requirements would typically be the 64-digit IRN code, the invoice type code, which will be, as we know, invoice, debit note, or a credit note, the invoice number and the date, supplier legal name, GSTN address and state, and his PIN code, same data for the buyer, And thereafter, if you are dealing in products, the dispatch from and the ship to details, and the invoice item details like the description, quantity, rate, HSN, value of goods or services, the GST rate and the GST amount. These are the mandatory requirements. Over and above these mandatory requirements, there are around 120 odd extra fields where you can put optional data. And the objective of the government actually is to reduce the paperwork. Like today, for most of the payments, you will not write checks. You will do an RTGS or an NEFT. And an online payment mechanism has virtually replaced the issuance of checks on a day-to-day basis. Now, that is something similar which the government is ambitiously planning, that once e-invoicing becomes applicable across the board, it might be possible that the seller may not need to raise a document at all. He will prepare an e-invoice. He will email this e-invoice to the buyer. And as far as the buyer is concerned, the buyer can read that e-invoice and incorporate it directly into his systems. So that is a long-term objective. And that's why there are optional fields. If you are implementing e-invoicing in your system, maybe you can look at having it ready in a manner in which the buyer systems can read it. The IRN is generated on the basis of the combination of the supplier GST and financial year, the document type, and the invoice number or the document number. Based on this, it is sent through an algorithm, computer algorithm, cryptology algorithm known as SHA-256 algorithm. And what it generates is a random 64-digit code, which you can see in the box below. It's a very random number, and therefore it's basically meant for the computers to generate it and put it on an invoice. I doubt whether you can really do this manually or pick it up from somewhere and retype this entire thing. It's going to be a pain in the neck to do all of that. Along with that, there will be a QR code which will contain the key parameters, and it will also contain a digital signature of the invoice registration portal. And this QR code, which is generated and incorporated in the document, one can just scan this QR code. And once the QR code is scanned, the status of the invoice on the government portal and the details can be visualized or seen by an app. I would request all of you to download this app. It's available on the government portal, and you can take it on your smartphone, and it will help you whenever any of your vendors sends you an invoice. You can just point your mobile towards this QR code on that invoice, and you will know whether the supplier has uploaded it on the GST portal or not, because this is a common question which many companies ask. So when you have this is how the invoice typically looks like. It has an IRN at some place. It also has a QR code, which you can see here. And that QR code, as I told you, one can just scan and identify, and all the data which you are able to see on this document will be visible over there in the app also. And you will be able to revalidate the document based on this QR code. So coming back to the entire process flow, what changes, how it changes. As of today, you have an ERP and an accounting software. And at the end of each month, you take a sales register from this. Maybe you take it in Excel, and then you upload it in GSTR1, which goes onto the government portal. This happens by the 11th of the next month. Maybe you might do it in-house. You might send it to your tax consultant to do it for you. And therefore, if you raise an invoice on, let us say, the 2nd of September or the 3rd of September, assuming e-invoicing is not applicable, the customer will know whether the document is correctly done or not only around 11th of October, because that's when you will upload your GSTR1 for the month of September. And that's when the customer will be able to see the transaction in his GSTR2. So that's the current process, which is shown on the yellow arrow, which is at the top. Now, what we are now bringing in is 3 different sets of systems in between. Definitely 2. One is the invoice registration portal. Once e-invoicing has become applicable to you, you have an invoice registration portal. Please note, this invoice registration portal is managed by NIC and not by Infosys. It's different from the GST system, which is managed by Infosys, though there are linkages between these two. So there's the GST system, there's the invoice registration system, and sometimes, or rather in many cases, you might have an ASP GSP with you. So therefore, you have now 4 systems to look at, and the data flows from your ERP into the ASP GSP, into the invoice registration portal, into the GST network, and goes to the customer. Now, because IRN is on a real-time basis, all this information starts flowing to the customer on a real-time basis. So if you raise an invoice on 3rd of September and you generate an IRN on that day, Maybe after a week, you courier it to the customer. Before the customer receives the courier, he would have received a message in his GSTR2A to say that, look, this person has already uploaded this invoice in your system. And therefore, it results in a really transparent flow of information. Now, this transparent flow of information has certain challenges in it. And the first challenge which comes is the relating to backdated transactions. And as we all know, many a times we might be required to raise an invoice. Maybe today we are on 3rd of September, but you might be raising an invoice for August or sometimes for July also. And now, of course, with the GSTR1, July becomes a bit difficult anyways. But there are situations where, a few days delay happens in the raising of the invoice. So the invoice date might be today mentioned as 31st of August, but you will still generate the invoice on 3rd or 4th of September. Now, these types of gaps will be clearly visible to everybody in the system because there is a digital signature of the IRP and the digital signature has a date stamp attached to it. Therefore, there will be challenges on these types of backdated transactions and changes in the transactions once it has been created and an IRN has been generated. And that's why one is there could be intentional changes where the business requirements make you change. Let us say the customer says, instead of Mr. X, please give me an invoice in the name of Mr. Y. You will have to do it. And naturally, you will prefer a credit note and a fresh invoice route in that case. But sometimes, ground level data entry operators or accountants may not understand the limitations or the challenges which are likely to come in. And therefore, sometimes as a casual approach, they might do some backdated entries. And that's where most of the softwares permit you to have a lock which says that, okay, a person will only be able to enter vouchers on the current date or 1 or 2 days before, but not maybe a week before or 10 days before. So if your software doesn't have something like that, it maybe makes sense to really check with your vendors and software vendors and try to bring in those types of locks. As far as the choice of the ASP GSP is concerned, it's important to understand that they are private players and therefore whatever data is available with them, there is a risk of it being misused. Of course, they are not permitted to do that. And therefore your trust on the ASP GSP and the confidentiality parameters will become very important. There's also the aspect which you will evaluate about the use, whether it's easy to use and navigate, whether their existing data will be easily transitioned in terms of masters and other information, and whether that ASP GSP offers you an integrated approach. Now, of course, all of you are from businesses, so over and above this, you will definitely consider the commercial aspects of the costs involved in involving an ASP GSP, and accordingly, you can take a final call on which type of an ASP GSP you want to choose. As far as the IRP is concerned, they do not permit, once an IRN is generated, they do not permit any amendment in the data because as IRN itself is based on certain data of the invoice, and therefore no amendment is permitted in the IRN. At the most, what you are permitted to do is you are allowed to cancel an IRN once generated, and that cancellation window is a running window of 24 hours. So if you generate an invoice today at 4 p.m., then you will be able to cancel that IRN up to 3:59 p.m. tomorrow. And thereafter, the IRN portal does not keep the data. At the end of each date, it just purges out this data and sends it to the GST portal. And once it goes in the GST portal, there is a real-time update in your GSTR1, which creates your tax liability, and in the customer's GSTR2A, which enables him to claim input tax credit. Naturally, when it comes in GSTR1 on a day-to-day basis, at the end of the month, when you are filing GSTR1, you will be required to do a reconciliation because there are still some teething problems which does come in at the entire process. So to summarize on this process flow, an important aspect which is the way forward is clearly that there is a lot of additional transparency vis-a-vis customer, and there will be a nearly a real-time finalization of your accounts and records. All of this is very important, especially if you are in the SME sector and you might feel that, I will do my adjustments for profits or tax calculations and all at the end of the year. Perhaps that may no longer work in the new process. There will be reconciliations because there are as many systems, and if those systems don't tally in terms of the values, then you will be expected to do the reconciliation. And therefore, our basic suggestion to most of our clients is that they should avoid any ad hoc cancellations or amendments. Many of the ERPs anyways do not permit a cancellation of an invoice. It's better to do a credit note for an error which has been committed and then raise a fresh invoice for the correct transaction. That would be a better route as compared to a cancellation or an amendment in an invoice upfront itself. The way forward, as we can clearly see, is identifying the proper source of technology. Technology clearly is going to be the way ahead, and basis the points which we discussed in an earlier slide, you will have to choose a proper ASP GSP, ensure an integration of your ERP software or your accounting software or your invoicing software with the ASP GSP solutions, and also look at a possibility of an IRN generation at a real-time basis. If not possible at a real-time basis, at least on a batch process basis, with at least 3 or 4 times the batch being run during the day. As far as the finance and account side is concerned, please understand the consequences of non-compliance. What we are told is that if an entity is required to generate an e-invoice and he does not generate an e-invoice, then the invoice will not be a valid invoice. So therefore, you will be stuck with penalties. Those penalties will be around 25,000 for each instance of the invoice. And I can tell you, in some cases, your invoice values may be less than 25,000. And therefore, you could be staring at a substantial penalty for this non-compliance. Of course, courts will then say that, okay, please impose a token penalty or something like that. But then you are still dependent on the officers, and there will be a litigation around that front. Therefore, if you are liable, please ensure as a supplier, you make sure that you comply with the provisions. Now, the fact that a person who is required to raise an e-invoice raises a manual invoice, that manual invoice is not treated as a tax invoice, also means that for the buyer, for claiming input tax credit, it is important that he has a valid e-invoice. And therefore, it's also important for you to look at your expense side and make sure that your vendors, whoever are liable for the 50 crore, are above 50 crores of limit, they are complying with the e-invoice. And to check that, you can always go to the site which we just saw in the first slide and put the GST number of the vendor and check out. Or you can write an email to them, like we write emails for MSME compliances and other things. You can write an email and get responses from them. But a vendor due diligence may be required on this one. At a tax compliance level, what is also important is to understand that the B2B transactions will get populated automatically in your GSTR1. And therefore, at the end of the month, you need to download that GSTR1, auto-populated based on the IRN, compare it with your sales register, do a reconciliation, and only upload additional transactions which have been missed out, which primarily, ideally, should be only B2C transactions or some errors or omissions. From a business and operations perspective, they need to understand that backdated invoices will become a thing of the past, or rather has already become a thing of the past. And also look at whether we want to look at all of this IRN generation to be a centralized process or a decentralized process. Especially in logistics, you might have 20, 30 loading points or business units. So where would you want the IRN responsibility to lie? Should it lie at a central office, head office, or should it be each branch's responsibility to make sure that they generate the proper IRNs on this front? So I think these are some of the decisions and the basic starting point of my presentation. Some of the questions I've already tried to cover in my presentation, and now we can take up the additional questions if there are any. Over to you, Priya, to take it forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sunil. It was a fantastic presentation, and answers, like you said already, that it answers a lot of questions. One small disclaimer which I would like to just quickly read out for all our attendees is that this knowledge session has been organized by AMTOI for its members and the logistics trade in general. The presentation is for the information purpose only, and they do not replace independent professional judgment. The statement of facts and opinions expressed by the speaker in this session, it is Mr. Sunil, and are those of his, and unless expressly stated to the contrary, are not the opinion or position of AMTOI and its committee. AMTOI does not endorse or approve or assume any responsibility for the content, accuracy, and completeness of information presented. Unauthorized copying and reproduction and circulation is not permitted. Attendees may also note that the sessions will be recorded and only AMTOI holds the right to publish the same as and when required. This is a general disclaimer just for everyone's information. I'll also take up bring in the quick question answers. Prashant, you can take up one by one questions, and Sunil sir can help us answer them.
Yeah. So I think the first question we had received in the Q&A is the digital signature compulsory on the e-invoice? Without digital signature of e-invoice, will be treated as valid invoice?
Thank you, Deepak, for your question. A digital signature is not compulsory on an e-invoice because in the e-invoice, the IRN itself contains a digital signature of the government portal. So once the government has countersigned your document, your signature actually is very limited value on that entire perspective. And therefore, there's a very clear provision which says that an additional signature is not compulsory. If you want to put it, you can continue doing that. But otherwise, it is not compulsory. Once an e-invoice is issued, it will be a valid invoice.
So Sunil bhai, I have a counter question to that of Mr. Deepak Ghoshi's question. Few of our clients are not accepting that the invoice without any signature or a digital signature or a physical signature or whatever. I'm been trying to tell them that since it is already been authenticated by the GST server or the whatever authorities, there is no need of any type of signature, but they are still insisting on a physical signature.
Yeah, so that's why business realities and commercial experiences might require you to sign it. And typically, when you are raising an invoice on the customer, customers might have their own requirements. But if you refer Rule 48, it very clearly says this. So if you wish to argue with your customers, you can bring in Rule 48 and say that Rule 48 makes it very clear that a signature is not required.
Well, thank you. The second question is, can we adapt voluntarily invoicing? What are the benefits?
So unluckily, voluntary e-invoicing is not permitted as of now because there has to be an API linkage or an access, and without that access, voluntary e-invoicing is not permitted. So that is a challenge. There are entities who want to go ahead with e-invoicing, but they are unable to do it because their turnovers are not raised.
I think the third question we have already covered of the penalty in the presentation. The fourth one is we are registered as GTA and we are billing under the forward charge mechanism and our turnover is above 50 crores.
Yes, Akshay, for you, since your turnover is above 50 crores, you are raising B2B tax invoices and e-invoicing is applicable to you.
The next one is from Mr. Nitin Jain. As per FAQ on GST e-invoice IRN system, GTA is exempted from raising e-invoice. Please specify.
Yes, that exemption is only for the pure play transport activity. Now, typically, when you look at a GTA, you would also have many other activities. There would be warehousing, there would be various logistics support, there would be terminal handling charges, there would be freight. And if all those things are applicable, then clearly e-invoicing becomes applicable to you. It's only if you are a pure play GTA that e-invoicing will not apply to you, which according to us is not a very commonplace scenario in the industry.
The next one is from Mr. Manoj. In case of transfer of asset to branch, can you give an example?
I think a very simple example would be that you might be moving a computer from one branch to another branch, or at times you might even move stationaries because all the stationaries will be pre-printed at the head office and then sent to the branches. So there could be various examples like this.
Priya, do we have any further questions? Yeah.
I have the Word file. I'll share that on the screen.
Yeah.
There. Can you see the screen?
You need to zoom out a bit, Priya. Zoom out. Yeah, zoom out. It's not covering on the screen. At least on my screen.
Okay, is it okay now?
No, you'll have to shift a bit to the right. Sunil bhai, is it visible?
Yeah, I can read it. If it's okay, I'll read out the questions and answers.
Read out the questions, not an issue.
first question is from Sachin.
Yeah.
Who says that can anyone scan the QR code and get all the details? As I said, yes, there is an app. You will have to download that app on your mobile. Depending on your mobile, there are different apps for Android and iPhone. And once you download that app, just scan the QR code on that app and you will get all the details.
So when you say all the details, does this also mean that actually, let's say, even if a competitor gets a copy of our invoice, they get all the details, or what kind of?
Yes, they would. So all the details basically means the critical details, like the GSTN of the supplier, the GSTN of the recipient, and the values and the taxes and the invoice number and things like that. And the status of the GSTN, which is active or not.
Okay. Okay. The second question says, who can generate the e-invoice? So
it naturally is a taxpayer who can generate an e-invoice. Unlike e-way bill, which can be generated by any person, here e-invoice can be generated only after a login credential and an API access has been linked. And therefore, no third parties cannot generate e-invoice. It's only going to be the taxpayer who can generate an e-invoice.
The third question, I think it's already answered, but GST exempt sales invoice like ocean export, security deposit, etc. Is it necessary to generate an IRN?
The answer is no, it's not necessary. We already discussed this.
Yeah. So does the e-invoice schema apply to RCM? We've also discussed this. Yeah. Why is enforcing mandatory?
I think I started it in the preamble.
Yes. So if we can share any solution, if we need to change the product details once the e-way bill is generated.
I think once the e-way bill is generated, you cannot change any data in that. The only way is to cancel the generated e-way bill and generate a fresh e-way bill.
Okay. And why we need the IRN for e-invoicing? Is it applicable on credit note also?
I think we will address this. It is applicable on credit note, and we are not able to make any changes in the generated IRN. The only way is cancel that IRN and create a fresh IRN.
Is there any panel provision for delay in invoice? Normal tax invoice issued on timely basis. Further, GSTR 1 and GSTR 3 we also file timely basis. But due to unawareness of e-invoice, it got delayed to do e-invoice IRN generation.
I'm sure the government to start with will not impose penalties for a normal delay in e-invoicing. But if you ask me a strict legal interpretation, the 25,000 penalty applies even for delayed raising of any invoice.
Is IRN and QR code mandatory to print on the tax invoice before issuing?
Yes, it is mandatory if your turnover is above 50 crores.
Yeah. What would be expected time frame for applicability of e-invoice to all the registered persons?
I would believe that maybe the next April would be when they would downgrade this 50 crores to 20 or 10 crores. And below that, it will be a little bit tricky because when you look at an extremely tiny sector, means when you are talking of somebody having a 2 crore or a 3 crore turnover or a 5 crore turnover, expecting him to have all this wherewithal to do an e-invoicing correctly would be a catastrophe. So I think up to 50 crores, it was a bit easy and the sailing was also smooth. Maybe up to 20 crores also it can be smooth, but if they dip below that in the aggregate turnover, it's going to be a little bit tricky to ensure proper compliance. So I would believe that's how the timeframes would go by.
Can we change the e-invoice after posting the same or after finalizing the same?
As I said, no, you cannot change the e-invoice once generated. It is either you cancel it, that too is within a period of 24 hours. And if that is not possible, then issue a credit note or a debit note.
And how to rectify in case e-invoicing is, that's the same question. We found some mistake in invoice. Whether we can adopt e-invoicing voluntarily?
We have answered it.
Yeah. Is it having any connection with SCMTR? I don't think so.
I am not too much aware of that provision, so I cannot.
Are the rules applicable in case the turnover is expected to exceed the threshold limit?
No, you have to look at the actual turnover exceeding the limit and not the expectations.
Are we going to standardize the e-invoice format also?
Yes, the e-invoice format is standardized. I mean, the content is standardized. You can keep that content either at the top or the bottom or wherever you want to, but the content and the fields are standardized.
What is the benefit of e-invoice in GST and why QR code is? I think we've already
Addressed.
How e-invoicing will help the freight industry to service clients in superior way and stop any revenue leakage?
So basically, there's a real-time data exchange, and that real-time data exchange will definitely help in ensuring stopping revenue leakage.
So, but it does give a thread that anyone can read the charges. That is something, the QR code anyone downloads can actually get the information. Also, so each invoice now becomes more this thing.
No, but that Priya would anyways be there because the QR code is there only on the invoice. So if anyone has an access to an invoice, the digital version of that invoice being able to see, honestly doesn't give any additional advantage.
What are technical requirements for e-invoicing?
We will discuss that. I think the ASP, GSPs or the offline utility.
So, Mr. Jaiswal says, if I have more than 500 invoicing and all are in IRM generated, but due to portal working slow, sometimes it is not reflecting prior to due date in GSTR1 B2B. Now I cannot add manually as there is limitation of up to 500. So I have to download JSON file and upload existing file on offline utility and delete it. And I have to upload offline my utility fresh template file, which I have worked, and there is no any IRN option in offline utility in template. So is it a problem for future?
My answer and advice, simple advice to someone like Jason is that if you have this type of a data, it's better to choose an ASP, GSP. Please don't be penny wise, pound foolish.
Yeah, because the penalties are much higher than the
That's
cost. While generating the invoice of intrastate for freight courier charges, the portal automatically shows RCM applicable as yes, although it was tax invoice with IGST amount raised to client.
No, it does not automatically show. Maybe there is some error in your linkages, either at the ASP, GSP level or at your invoicing level. There is a field called RCM flag. If you would have ticked it as yes, the portal will show it as yes. Otherwise, it can't show it as yes.
So I think this is a question which we've already, is digital signature compulsory on e-invoice? Aggregate turnover, you mentioned that total of 3 years more than 50 crore or any
one year in past 3 years over 50 crores, not total of all the 3 years. It's individual year, any of the 3 years if it's about
one financial year.
Yeah.
What would be the penalty if tax invoice issued without IRN and QR code?
I think we've already talked about it.
So these are some of the questions. There are more questions which have come here. E-invoicing is required in case of export of service. In such cases, GSTIN is not available as the overseas customer is not registered. Can the invoice be generated without GSTN?
So for an export invoice, moment you say outside India, they allow you to generate a e-invoice without a GSTN, otherwise it is not allowed.
Okay. Reimbursement expense with GST invoice and without GST invoice, both form part of turnover or only GST invoice?
Wherever you are charging GST on a reimbursement bill, that will be treated as a part of the aggregate turnover. If you are treating something as a pure agent like the customs duty recovery, then it will not be treated as a part of your aggregate turnover at all.
So apart from customs duty, we also have a lot of shipping line or a port charge, which is also sometimes directly, I mean, it's a complete reimbursement instead of...
So this is a little bit tricky, and therefore I've always guarded myself by giving an example of customs duty, because what constitutes reimbursement is a story in itself, and maybe we may need another session to take you through all the 4 conditions of pure agent and the controversies surrounding it. So I would believe that each entity will take his own call on what constitutes reimbursement and what constitutes taxable. this session I may not be totally endorsing your thought process to say that all shipping charges are reimbursement. They may not constitute reimbursements, and some of them may, some of them may not. So I don't want to go into that judgment right now. Right now, we just say that if it's a taxable transaction, e-invoice will be required. But if it is a pure agent transaction, then e-invoice is not required.
For any changes in invoices, if we raise credit note and customer not ready to accept, in this case, what to do?
I think these are commercial problems which do come up, and I think the only way to resolve them is through an active dialogue with the customer and try to convince them, or you get convinced.
Or whether within 24 hours the invoice is cancelled.
Yeah, I assume that it's not that scenario, because if it was cancelled
either,
within 24 hours,
either they have to do it within 24 hours cancellation or a credit note. That is the only way this allowed. So options and provision when system are down and not able to create e-invoice.
My understanding is that at least the government portals are fairly robust. Many of our clients are already into e-invoicing, and we have not seen major challenges on that front. So yes, if there have been outages and systems are down, maybe for an hour or half an hour, I think there's no option but to wait. When the entire country went into a lockdown, we had no option but to wait. So here also, I think there's no option but to wait in those types of scenarios.
By saying cancellation of IRN, do you mean the IRP will accept the same invoice number with certain amended fields, or do we need to raise the CN against the original invoice?
Once an IRN is cancelled, thereafter you may be able to raise with the same invoice number. But if the IRN was not cancelled, then naturally you cannot raise with the same invoice number again.
Okay.
Because there's a deduplication test which comes in.
Okay. I think we've covered all the questions which are received at this moment, and we are just in time to actually close our event. It's just about 5 o'clock. So thank you so much, Mr. Sunil Gabhawalla. It was such an interesting and seriously a lot of questions answered, not only I'm sure of the participants, but even the questions maybe Prashant and I had as also answered. So thank you so much for your time and a valuable this thing. Prashant, do you want to give any closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Sunil Bhai, for an enlightening session. I'm sure I've also got some fantastic enlightenment in this program. We wish to have you, in future as well. So
it's always a pleasure. It's always my pleasure to be interacting with the members of the industry, and definitely it was a wonderful experience for me also to share my thoughts on this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Delzat, you can stop the recording, and thank you. Thank you.